There's a name that became etched in the memory of the residents of a small town and the surrounding region. For many years, this name was synonymous with fear and mystery, associated with a series of strange events and inexplicable disappearances. In the early spring of 1999, the police of a small town received a missing persons call. The report came from Carlos Mendez, a 40-year-old man who had lost contact with his wife, Patricia, 36, since the previous night. Carlos explained that he had tried to call her multiple times, but the call would drop after a few rings. Concerned, he sought help from the police. Immediately, the officers advised Carlos to stay calm and wait a little longer, as the case was still fresh. They questioned him about the previous days, and he confirmed he had reached out to family, friends, and even her workplace, but without success. Since there was no indication of danger, and the time of disappearance was still short, the police initially decided not to open a formal investigation. Carlos was advised to return home and wait. Back at his house, Carlos continued his search, but Patricia was nowhere to be found. The next day he returned to the police station, and this time they decided to take more serious action. He told the police that his wife was the manager of a logistics company in the city. On the morning of April the 2nd, Patricia had left for work as usual, around 7 a.m. She showed no signs of anything unusual and seemed perfectly fine. Carlos, who worked as a civil engineer at a different company, wasn't involved in Patricia's daily activities, so he wasn't familiar with her exact routine or whom she interacted with. Carlos firmly stated that his wife wouldn't have just disappeared, as she was very dedicated to her work and family and had no reason to leave everything behind. He also assured the police that he trusted her completely, and there was no chance she had left him for someone else. Based on his statements, the police also ruled out the possibility of a kidnapping, as there was no ransom demand. After 2 days of no progress, the police began to consider that Patricia might have had an accident. However, when they checked local hospitals and morgues, they didn't find any unidentified victims matching Patricia's description. They decided to send more teams to search remote areas like riverbanks and mountain trails, but after a full day, they found nothing. The police then went to Patricia's workplace to gather information from her colleagues. They learned that she hadn't shown up to work on the morning of April 2nd. Her assistant revealed that Patricia had mentioned personal matters and asked him to handle her work that day. This raised two big questions. If Patricia wasn't at work, where could she have gone? And why had she lied to her husband about going to the office when they had always been so honest with each other? The police began investigating Patricia's social circle, starting with Carlos. Neighbors informed them that although the couple seemed loving, their relationship wasn't as smooth as it appeared. A few days before Patricia disappeared, neighbors had heard them having a huge argument. One curious neighbor went over and saw the door tightly closed, with loud noises coming from inside like glass breaking. Fearing the argument could escalate, the neighbor tried to intervene, but the disturbing sounds continued. This new information increased the police's suspicions. The police began considering that Carlos might have been involved in his wife's disappearance and could have staged it to mislead the investigation. While keeping a close eye on his behavior, the police received a report of an unidentified female body found near a river not far from Carlos's house. They quickly sent officers to verify the situation. A forensic examination revealed that the victim was a woman aged between 30 and 35, and the time of death matched closely with Patricia's disappearance. The family was called to identify the body. Patricia's sister, Anna, immediately recognized the woman as her sister, noting the similar appearance, hairstyle, and clothing. However, Carlos firmly disagreed, saying the body wasn't Patricia's. This conflicting identification puzzled the police. They decided to perform a DNA test to confirm the identity. The results were shocking. The body wasn't Patricia's. With the case stalled, the police continued to investigate Carlos's activities. He explained that after Patricia left on April 2nd, a colleague named Rodrigo picked him up for work. Rodrigo confirmed seeing Patricia leave the house that morning and said he and Carlos worked together all day, providing an alibi. When Carlos couldn't reach Patricia, he became very worried and asked Rodrigo to help search for her throughout the night. With this new information, Carlos was cleared of suspicion. As time passed, the investigation became increasingly difficult. The absence of witnesses made progress slow. Meanwhile, Patricia's family distributed missing person flyers and continued searching, but without success. Nearly 2 months passed, and Patricia's whereabouts remained unknown. On June 18th, the police announced the discovery of a woman's body in a remote park. The description of the clothes and personal items matched Patricia's. When Carlos saw the report on TV, he was shocked. He immediately drove to the police station to confirm the identity. The DNA test confirmed that the body was indeed Patricia's. Carlos explained that his wife had enjoyed visiting peaceful, remote places to meditate, but he didn't understand why she would have gone to such a distant park. He also couldn't comprehend who would have committed such a brutal crime. Despite the police's efforts, the case was growing increasingly difficult. The lack of evidence, time, and rain that washed away clues made progress hard to achieve. The case was becoming more complicated, and the police feared the perpetrator was someone close to the victim. While the investigation continued without significant breakthroughs, new reports started to surface. By the end of September, 3 other similar cases of disappearances occurred in the same area, heightening the fear among local residents. The police, now concerned about a potential serial killer, ramped up their search efforts, but finding the culprit seemed more elusive than ever. As time passed and fear grew in the small town, the investigation seemed to be lost in the shadows, with no clear clue emerging to link the disappearances. The name Patricia Mendez, now marked by mystery and tragedy, continued to echo among the locals, like an eerie whisper that refused to let their hearts rest. The authorities were at the edge of exhaustion, still unaware of the sinister force that hung over the town, manipulating events relentlessly. But on a silent night, when the stars were barely visible behind a thick layer of clouds, a new piece of the puzzle appeared. A phone call came to the police station, more like an intuition than a factual discovery. The voice on the other end was tense, nervous, barely holding up under the weight of its own revelation. "I saw something," said the voice. "Something that might be important in an old lighthouse near the forest." And with those words, the phone abruptly hung up, leaving the officers with a chilling shiver. The lighthouse, a solitary structure that had seen better days, stood far from the town, in a remote area along the coast. It was the type of place that at night became a thin line between land and sea, where local ghost stories and mysteries seemed to take on a life of their own. Those who passed by would say that the sound of waves crashing against the rocks at dusk almost seemed like a lament, as if the lighthouse held memories of centuries of unresolved tragedies. It was there that the investigators went, guided only by the instinct the anonymous call had stirred within them. When they arrived, the lighthouse stood imposing in the darkness, its walls worn down by time, but still exuding a sense of strength and solitude. With every step they took, the air grew thicker, charged with an unusual energy. The lighthouse seemed to hide something it didn't want to be found. The officers searched the surroundings and finally discovered a rusted door leading to the base of the lighthouse, an entrance long neglected, covered by a thick layer of dirt and wild vines. When they managed to open the door, the smell of mold and salt water hit them like a strong wave. Inside, silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of water droplets falling from the ceiling, reverberating on the ancient walls. The atmosphere, more than heavy, was thick with a presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. In the center of the room, a wooden table was covered in strange objects. Among them were extinguished candles, scraps of paper with bizarre symbols, and an old wooden box that seemed to have been hidden for decades. Reluctantly, one of the officers approached and opened the box. Inside was a peculiar object, a small stone figure worn down by time with almost human-like features, but distorted, as if the very essence of the creature had been frozen in a state of eternal pain. Upon looking at the figure, an unsettling feeling overtook everyone present. They knew they had found something significant, something hidden for a reason much greater than they could understand. What disturbed them even more, however, was the fact that the box was marked with the same symbol that had been found on some of Patricia's personal items. The ring, the gold necklace. This was no coincidence. Someone had left clues, drawing. An invisible line between the disappearances and the lighthouse seemed to be the other victims, including Lu Jing and He Lingling, were beginning to piece together their own parts of the puzzle, driven by grief and loss, but also by the growing feeling that something more was at play. A dark pattern was beginning to form, and each clue found seemed to point to something much older and deeper than simple isolated crimes. The lighthouse, now revealed as a place of forgotten rituals, could be the key to solving the disappearances. But as the investigators delved deeper, something even more disturbing began to emerge. An ancient local legend, lost in the stories passed down from generation to generation, spoke of an entity that watched over souls lost between the world of the living and the dead. This entity, known only as the Voice of the Night, had been forgotten by many, but it was about to be awakened. From that moment on, the investigators realized that to uncover the truth about Patricia's fate and the other victims, they would need to face not just a killer, but a much more powerful force, something that had waited patiently in the shadows, ready to return and claim what had been taken from it. The winds began to change, and the fog seemed to thicken around the lighthouse. The mystery that now engulfed the town was no longer just about disappearances, but about something deeper, something supernatural that was about to reveal itself in a terrifying and unpredictable way. Who was behind all this? And what did the stone figure have to do with it? The answer was drawing closer, but as always, the truth would come at a price, a very high price. As the investigation reached its fever pitch, the truth became harder to grasp, slipping through their fingers, like sand. The officers, now desperate and exhausted, turned to the only place they hadn't fully explored, the lighthouse itself. Its presence was undeniable, ancient, looming, and more than just a structure. It was a marker, a gateway, a place of power. Inside, after days of research, they uncovered a hidden staircase, spiraling down into the bowels of the lighthouse. Each step felt like a descent into the unknown, and the air grew colder with every turn. When they finally reached the bottom, they were met with a room that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. The walls were covered in faded symbols, and at the center of the room was an altar covered in dust and cobwebs. Surrounding it were rows of objects, some familiar, some unrecognizable, but they all had one thing in common. Each item had been touched by the victims. There in the center of it all lay the stone figure, the same one they had found earlier. The symbols on it seemed to shift and change in the dim light, as if they were alive, reacting to their presence. And then, standing before the altar, the officers saw it, the final clue. It was an old journal, hidden beneath a pile of dust. It belonged to a man who had once lived in the town, a man who had been known as a healer, but who had disappeared decades ago under strange circumstances. The journal detailed the life of a man obsessed with the boundary between life and death, who sought to commune with the dead and wield their power. He had believed that by taking the souls of the living, he could bring them to the other side, where they would be trapped forever, neither living nor dead. And to do so he used a dark ritual, one that required an object of great significance. The stone figure was the key. It was a representation of an ancient entity, a spirit that fed on the energy of the lost and the trapped. Those who had disappeared, Patricia, Lu Jing, He Lingling, were never meant to return. Their souls were meant to serve as conduits, forever bound to the spirit that had been summoned in the depths of the lighthouse. The stone figure, now pulsing with a faint light, was the physical manifestation of the entity, its form twisted and unnatural. Suddenly the air grew thick. The very walls of the lighthouse seemed to come alive, creaking and groaning under the pressure of something dark and immense. A voice, low and whispering, echoed through the room. "You should not have come." The officers froze, terror seizing their hearts. The voice of the night, the entity that had been waiting all these years, had awoken. But it was too late to turn back. The energy in the room surged, and the officers felt themselves being pulled toward the altar, drawn by an invisible force. Desperately, they tried to break free. but it was as if the very ground beneath them was holding them in place, binding them to the altar. As they struggled, one of them managed to reach the journal and, with trembling hands, tore out the final page. On it, there was a prayer, a chant that, when spoken aloud, would break the ritual and send the entity back to the darkness from which it had emerged. With no other choice, the officer began to chant the words, and the stone figure began to tremble as if trying to resist. The voice in the room grew louder, more desperate, but the officer's resolve did not waver. Finally, with a deafening roar, the stone figure shattered, and a blast of cold air swept through the room. The walls collapsed inward, and the lighthouse itself seemed to crumble beneath the weight of the curse it had held for so long. In the chaos, the officers managed to escape, stumbling out into the night, gasping for breath. As the lighthouse collapsed behind them, the voice fell silent. The next morning, the town awoke to find that the disappearances had stopped. The streets, once filled with an eerie silence, now felt alive again. But there were no celebrations, no triumphs, only the lingering sense that something had been lost. The town, forever scarred by what had happened, would never be the same. And the stone figure, broken and shattered, was never found. Some say it still exists, buried deep, beneath the ruins of the lighthouse, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The darkness, after all, is never truly gone. It just waits for the right moment to return. Next, in the sleepy town of Hollow Creek, nestled among dense forests and mist-covered hills, strange things were happening. The town was small, its streets empty most days, save for the occasional shopper or dog walker. But for years there had been an undercurrent of unease, a whispered rumor that no one seemed to talk about aloud. People disappeared, but never for long. It was as if the woods themselves were swallowing them up. The first incident occurred on a cold November evening, when Eleanor Grant, a young journalist for the local paper, went missing. Eleanor was known for her curiosity, her sharp eyes always seeking the story hidden beneath the surface of things. But one evening, as she left her office to take a walk by the creek that wound through the town, she simply vanished. Her disappearance was odd. There were no signs of struggle, no sign of forced entry into her apartment, no messages left behind. It was as if she had just walked into the forest and never returned. The only thing that remained was her notebook, found by a local fisherman by the edge of Hollow Creek, pages soaked and smeared with ink, as if she'd been writing frantically before she disappeared. The local police launched a search. They combed the woods for days but found nothing but the usual traces of wildlife. Eleanor's disappearance was soon labeled an accident or perhaps a personal decision, but to those who knew her, it felt wrong. Something wasn't right. Months passed and Hollow Creek seemed to go back to its peaceful routine. But then another person disappeared, Clara Thompson, the town's librarian. Clara had been Eleanor's closest friend, and when she went missing in the same mysterious way, the rumors started to swirl again. This time there were whispers of something darker, that the town, or perhaps the woods surrounding it, had a sinister presence. Some said the creek had a curse. Others believed it was a malevolent spirit that haunted the land. Detective Lena Harper was brought in to investigate, but she was a stranger to Hollow Creek and the locals weren't quick to open up. She couldn't ignore the tension in the air as she walked through the cobblestone streets, where every corner seemed to hide a secret. The investigation uncovered little, other than that both women had been drawn to the woods to the creek in the days leading up to their disappearances. It was during a visit to Eleanor's apartment that Lena found something strange. A map, tucked between the pages of Eleanor's journal. It was a map of Hollow Creek, but it was marked with strange symbols that Lena hadn't seen before. The creek was marked with a thick red X, and there was an annotation in Eleanor's handwriting. The water calls. Listen closely. The map was the key. Lena started digging into the history of the town, and the more she uncovered, the more unsettling the story became. Hollow Creek was founded centuries ago, and its original settlers had been a superstitious group, obsessed with the idea of rituals to appease the forces of nature. The creek, they believed, was a sacred site, one that could communicate with those who listened carefully. According to Old Town records, there had been several disappearances in Hollow Creek's history, each one tied to the same pattern. People who had visited the creek at night, drawn by some unknown force, only to vanish without a trace. As Lena studied the patterns, she realized the disappearances weren't random. They were cyclical. Every 20 years, someone would vanish. But why? What was the connection to the creek? One night, unable to shake her curiosity, Lena ventured out to the creek alone. She arrived just before midnight under a blanket of fog that covered the landscape, and the only sound was the soft rush of the water. She stood by the creek, feeling an eerie sense of familiarity, as if something was watching her, waiting. As she stared into the dark water, something caught her eye, a faint reflection in the surface. It wasn't the reflection of the trees or the moon, but something else, a figure. It was faint, as if the water itself had come alive, and it seemed to be beckoning her. Before she could react, a voice whispered in her ear, soft and distant, "The water calls. Will you listen?" A chill ran down Lena's spine as the reflection in the creek shimmered, becoming clearer. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. The figure was Eleanor. She was standing in the water, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide with fear. Then, just as quickly, the vision vanished, replaced by nothing but the dark, rippling surface of the creek. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The creek wasn't just a body of water. It was alive. It held something that wanted to trap people in its depths. The whispers, the disappearances, the calls, they were all part of the same sinister force that had been waiting for the right moment to claim its victims. Determined to put an end to the horror that had plagued Hollow Creek for centuries, Lena dove into the town's oldest records, piecing together what remained of the original settlers' journals. She found a ritual, a forgotten incantation that was said to have sealed the creek's power long ago. The ritual required an offering, something of great personal value, something to appease whatever entity was hiding beneath the surface. But there was one problem. The ritual had never been completed. The final part, the offering, had never been made. And so Lena, knowing what she had to do, returned to the creek once more, the weight of the town's dark history pressing down on her. She stood on the banks, the fog swirling around her, and began to chant the incantation she had memorized. As the words left her lips, the creek began to stir. The water churned violently, and a cold wind whipped through the trees, as if the very land was fighting against her. But Lena didn't stop. She had to finish it. With a final word, the water calmed. The whispers ceased. The figure of Eleanor appeared one last time, smiling gently, as if thanking Lena for breaking the cycle. The next morning, the town woke to an unfamiliar peace. The fog had lifted, the creek was still, and for the first time in decades there were no missing persons reports. The darkness had been banished, or so it seemed, but the people of Hollow Creek knew better. The land was ancient, and its secrets were buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for the next time the water would call. As for Lena, she left Hollow Creek with a sense of closure, but a lingering unease. She knew that some mysteries were never truly solved, and that the darkness would always be waiting, just beneath the surface. I want to thank each of you who watched the video to the end. Your presence and attention make every story more special. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, comment with your thoughts, and share it with anyone who enjoys a good mystery and suspense. And of course, make sure to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring more intriguing mysteries, like this one. Stay tuned, as in the next video another mystery will be waiting for you. Until then, may the shadows of mystery continue to follow us. See you soon.